All right, HaKadosh Baruch. All right, HaKadosh Baruch. It might be one of those mornings. All right, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we got this. We can do this together. When we partner, we can do anything. Good morning, Rabosai. It's grace Baruch Hashem to continue another day of Menachos. Shkach to everyone who attended the Siyum last night. Really like an epic Siyum last night. A tremendous shkach to all of our incredible, impactful, riveting, and overwhelming speakers. Tazriel Miller for coordinating. Baruch Hashem, incredible. Well, with that, let us begin. Thank you to all of our sponsors for this morning's daf. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for Shvat, Habadin, Latova, Mel, and Karen Ram for dedicating all of Shimon Drashos this month with tremendous Hakaras Hatov to Hashem for all the happiness, blessing, and good He has brought into our lives. Our week of learning sponsor, Stephen Zdenik Alaskov, Le'ilui Nishma, Steve's grandfather, Yitzchak Hirsch Ben Meir, whose yahrzeit was yesterday. Sham Shavin Ali, we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Shavin Aliyah, all the families in Nechama, all those who need refuah, should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, and Halvai Chdosh Baruch Hu Sheshar Brachas and Besoros Tovos upon Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. With that, let us begin. Today's daf is Yud Aleph 11, and we are picking up Baruch Hashem on Yud Aleph at the 2 dots. We left off 2, 4, 6, 8 lines in. So remember again, the Mishnah said that when you take the kometz, remember the previous piece that we kind of did quickly at the end of yesterday's daf, is if when you scoop up the kometz, you have any farm material. Now, what's the definition of farm material? It could be salt, right? It could be melach, it could be lavona, or what was the third one? Or a pebble, thank you, or a pebble. So again, what's the idea was why? Because if you have any of these items within the kometz, by definition, that means the kometz is deficient. Okay, so now that's the same as the Gemara, because if you read, if you have a kometz that is too large in measure or too small in measure, ultimately, again, the kometz is possible. So the Gemara says, my area mishum chasra v'yeser. I don't understand. So let's play this out. Right. So let's say again, I have a pebble inside of the kometz. So now obviously there is flour missing where that pebble would have been. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, the kometz is possible. So I understand. The Gemara says there's a different reason. Forget about getting into the fact that it's deficient or you have too much, too little. Seifakle mishum chatzitza. So this is very interesting. Isn't the presence of foreign material in a kometz a problem of chatzitza? What's chatzitza? Anytime you have something that is not supposed to be there, that interposes between the object and your body. Because remember, again, I will say, the chatzitza is supposed to be held where? In your hand. So if you have foreign material mixed into that flour, then by definition, there's something interposing between your hand and the rest of the chatzitza. Isn't that a problem? On Rabbi Yomi Minat Sad, so Rabbi Yirmiyah says, no, we could be dealing with a case where the foreign material is, let's say, by the side. By the side means over here, let's say it's here. In other words, right, it's by, we're going to talk about the piece in just a moment, but the point is, it's not really in my hand as much as it is by the side. So it's not really interposing between my hand and the chametz itself. Nevertheless, it poses a problem because it's taking up space where flour should have been, and therefore the chametz is deficient, and therefore it is going to go ahead and be possible. Okay, so the Gemara goes back there. Amalei Abaye, l'Rava, Keitzad Komsim. This is very exciting because now the Gemara is going to get a little bit into the mechanics of chametza. How do you do a chametza? Keitzad Komsim, right? How does chametza work? Amalei, this is an interesting answer. Kidekamtsi inshi, like people take a handful. Okay, thank you, very helpful. Now, I will say, now what's interesting about that answer is the way that Rava seems to be saying is that if you look at Rashi says over here, Rashi says, Kidekamtsi inshi mashma kol ha'etzbaos. So what's interesting is Rava seems to understand that a handful is all of the fingers. That's what he seems to say. Right? When you take a handful of something, generally you take your entire hand and you grab. So that's what Rava seems to be saying. So the Gemara says, here's the problem with that. So Abaye raised the kasha to Rava. So is that true? Rava say, now interestingly enough, each of the fingers themselves have a different name. The Gemara says, Zu Zeres, Zu Kamitza. The pinky is called Zeres. Ultimately, again, so and there are different. We'll see a little bit of logic behind this. Zu kamitza. Interestingly enough, I guess what we call like the ring finger, that is called kamitza. Zu ama, the middle finger is called ama. Zu etzba, the index finger is called etzba. Zu godel, and the thumb is called godel. Now Rashi actually points out over here that these names are actually meaningful, because again, interestingly enough, their different fingers are used as the basis point for different measurements. So for example, the pinky, zeres, was used ultimately again in measurements for the choshen, the breastplate for the Kohen Gadol. Zu kamitza, Rashi says over here, why is the ring finger called kamitza? Why? Because that's the finger with which you begin the kamitza, right? The pinky is not used in kamitza. I mean, it's used a little bit, we'll talk about this, but it's the ring finger that is ultimately used for kamitza. Zu ama, the middle finger is called ama. I will say this is actually very interesting. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says, "Mimena modedin kol amos habinyan v'hakelim lefi shehi aruka mikulan u'shtei amos hayu b'shushan abira shtei maklo shein ama u'modedin amos habinyan." So in the Beis Hamikdash, they had measurements, a measurement called an amma. Now, okay, if you thought Judaism wasn't confusing enough, the amma measurement wasn't an amma. It was called an amma. Now, we'll say, what was the measurement based on? It was based on the measurement of the top of your middle finger to the elbow. That was a standardized measure inside of the Beis Hamikdash. So therefore, the middle finger is called the amma because at the height of it is the beginning, ultimately, of this measurement for the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, that's amma. Zu etzba. Etzba is the index finger. Why? Because again, remember, that's what the Kohen does zrika with. Whenever there's zrika is always done with the index finger. And zu godel. Godel is the thumb. Rashi points out lebanos, the metzora. So again, the thumb is called godel because that has ramifications for the blood applications or oil applications. So this one yesterday's daf for the metzora. What's the point of this? So remember again, Abai is asking on Rava. So Abai says, Rava, you say kamitza is done with all of the fingers. Here's the problem with that statement. What's the problem? The halacha, right, the Gemara explicitly calls the ring finger kamitza, which indicates to us that kamitza begins with the ring finger, which at least excludes the pinky from all of this. If that's the case, then your statement is incorrect. To which the Gemara says, Ella lahashvos. Rather, the Gemara says like this: what is the pinky used for? The pinky ultimately, again, is used to smooth out the measure. So really what happens over here is as follows. As we've classically been learning, kamitza is done with the three middle fingers, the ring finger, the middle finger, and the index finger. The role of the pinky and the thumb is to smooth out the measures. So that if anything is protruding from the measures, ultimately, again, they wipe it away smooth it down. Kilomar, kometz mali hayad kadesh lo yechasr v'achar kach mochik be'etzba kitana milamata. So the Gemara says, Hey Avid. So how exactly does this work? Amrav Zutra bar Tuvia Amra Amarav Chofe. So listen to this. Chofe shalosh etzbaos ad shemagia al pas yado. So here's the actual mechanics. Here is the actual mechanics of chafifa itself. You take the three fingers, and ultimately, again, now what the Gemara is describing over here is we're going to talk about how you insert it into the flour in just a moment. But for our purpose, what the Gemara is saying is like this: you take the three middle fingers, and you go ahead and you bring them down towards your palm. That's the chafifa. So whatever you can capture in there, that's the chafifa. That's the chafifa. Sorry, that's the kamitza. Excuse me. The kometz. Taina Melech writes that supports this. Melo kumso. So ultimately, the pasuk says, "You shall take a kometz full." Yochel mevuratz. So one might have thought that halacha lemaisa, this should be like overflowing. Talmud lower bekumso. Therefore, the Torah says no, just the kometz. I bekumso yochel barashe etzbaosav. I might have thought that maybe Rabbi say I just take rashe etzbaosav means like the fingertips. What does this mean? Maybe what you just do with the kometz is you put your fingers in it, you just take like the fingertips worth of flour. Talmud lomar melo kumso. You have to take a full kometz. So what is the definition of a full kometz? Ha ketzad. Rabbi say first wide line. Chofesh shalosh etzbaosav abhas yado. The kometz. Ultimately, again, you go ahead, like we said, you take your three middle fingers, You bring them down over your palm, extend them as far down over your palm as you can, and whatever amount of flour you could capture like that, that's going to be your kometz. Incredible. Now, Bosai, the Gemara says something very interesting, which we have not really seen up until now, which is very interesting. But machvas marchashas. Now, Bosai, we spoke about the machvas and marchashas already at the beginning of the Masechta in the first Mishnah, right? Minchas machvas is a shallow pan mincha. Minchas marchashas ultimately again is a deep dish mincha. So we'll say, so if you remember again, we spoke about those earlier. Now, what we did not learn is the following. We've always been looking at a mincha ultimately again as, or kmitz as something you do with the flour. We're going to see in the minchas, machvas, and marchashas, in fact, those were actually baked first, then broken up into small pieces, and the kmitza was done actually on the pieces of the mincha. Again, we'll get to this, but the Gemara is referencing this now. Mid b'machvas u'marchashas, mochek begodlo milamala ube'etzba'o ketana milamata. So listen to this. So now with a minchas machvas or marchashas, so you also do kmitza. What do? You take your three middle fingers into the broken pieces. You scoop up whatever you can with your three middle fingers, and then you kind of shave off the protruding pieces with your thumb and with your pinky. Now the Gemara says, "V'zohi avoda kasha sheba mikdash," and this is the hardest avoda in the Beis Hamikdash. Now, this is very interesting. Now, what's so complicated about this? So remember, Rabosai, there is, if you look at Rashi is the first wide line. Zoy avoda kash sheba mikdash shebekoshi gadolhi. This is very difficult. Shebekoshi gadolhu mashva shelo yehe chasra velo yoser. Now, remember again, Rabosai, what did we see? Kmitza 101. What do you have to do with Kmitza 101? You have to make sure that your kmitza is not deficient, and you have to make sure that your kmitza is not overflowing either. Which means there can't be anything missing from within your hand, but there also can't be anything protruding outside of your three fingers either. So now, when you're dealing with flour, that's relatively easy, right? Scoop up, as long as you have no foreign material, shave down the sides with your pinky and with your thumb, you're good to go. When you're dealing with pieces, here's the challenge. What's the challenge? If you have something protruding, what do you have to do? You have to break it. But what's the concern with breakage? What's the concern? That you may break off too much, and that the piece inside of you may have like pockets of emptiness inside you, right? You may have pockets of emptiness inside of your kmitza. So therefore, the Gemara says this is one of the hardest avodos, to be able to go ahead and on one hand shave off the protrusions without creating pockets of emptiness inside of the kmitza. So the Gemara says, what? Zehu v'sulo, that's the hardest avoda in the Beis Hamikdash? Really? That's the hardest thing? Va'ika malika. What about malika? Right? I know you've missed it. Admit it, you've missed malika, right? So what about malika? I will say malika is incredibly difficult. Because of the fact that you need a good amount of dexterity to be able to hold the bird, right? Remember, it's machlokes exactly if you're doing everything in one hand or in two hands. But either way, you need a good amount of dexterity. Plus, you need the ability to plunge your thumbnail in the right place in the back of the bird's neck to be able to go ahead and sever. But you can't sever too much because depending on chatos versus ola, does the head remain there or not? That sounds a lot more complicated than some kmitza. Or chafina. What about chafina? Rashi points out over here, what's chafina? We actually saw this before. It's the second wide line in Rashi. Chafina. Namir beperak otzio lo mesechas yuma yechaser. I'm sorry, beperak yuma. Oches es habazach beroshe etzbaosav umala begodlo v'zoy v'adakasha. Chafina, I will say, is the process ultimately again of emptying the ketores into your hands. Right? It's also scooping up the ketores, but then it's emptying the ketores from the shovel into your hands, which also required a tremendous amount of kohanic dexterity. So that sounds pretty complicated. So why does the Gemara say that kmitza is the hardest avodah? Which the Gemara says, no, that's not what I meant. Elazohi achos me'avodos kasho sheba mikdash. I didn't mean it's the hardest avodah. What did I mean to say? It's one of the hardest avodos in the Beis Hamikdash. So I will say, one has to ask themselves, why does the Gemara need to say this? Why does the Gemara need to say, Zohi avoda kasha sheba mikdash? Who cares? In other words, excuse me, what does it matter if it's easy or difficult? It's got to get done. If it's got to get done, why do Chazal have the need to say that there are difficult avodos, there are easier avodos? What's the point of the statement? And perhaps what Chazal are teaching us is a tremendous musar haskell. Things in life are difficult. Things in life are hard. I will say, we're often conditioned to think that if something is meant to be, then it should be easy, right? If HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants it, he's like going to pave the way for me, and there's not going to be any struggle. And we often look at struggle as maybe I've made like a wrong turn. If it was meant to be, it should be easy. If there's struggle, it must be that something's wrong. And especially like in Ruchnius, we have this expectation that things are supposed to be easy. And what does the Gemara say? Zohi avoda kasha shebamikdash. Even, you ever wonder about this? Like, why does HaKadosh Baruch Hu make things complicated in the Beis HaMikdash? Like, why go ahead and give us Malika? Why give us Chafina? Right? Can you imagine the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur has so much going on, and there literally is this whole balancing act with the Ketores, the Chafina, the pouring into this, the pouring into that, and he's got to hold the fire pan under his arm and like this. And like, why? Why not just make it easy? Because the Beis HaMikdash is a microcosm for life. And the HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying that there is avoda kasha in life. And we live in a time where everything is about like finding like a life hack. How do you make it easier? And by the way, that's good. That is good. It's good to make things easier when you can. But it's also important to understand that there are certain things in life that are never going to be easy. Ruchnius is never going to be easy. Our relationship with Hashem is never going to be easy. Self-actualization is never going to be easy. There is always avoda kasha in life. You could run from it or you can lean into it. Either way, it's there. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu models this for us by creating avoda kasha in the Beis HaMikdash. The moment that you accept that life is filled with hard work, that life is filled with struggle, that especially the more meaningful the thing you want, the harder, the greater the uphill battle is going to be, then you are prepared to embrace, to engage in the battle, and that's the first step to success. Incredible Gemara. Let's go back there. Amra Papa. So Papa says, Pshitali, Malo Kumso ki de Kamsi Inshi. So Papa says, very interesting. So back to Kmitza. So back to the mechanics. So Papa says that I think Malo Kumso means the way that people take Kmitza. Right, the way that people kidem kamsi inshi. Rashi says over here, third white line in Rashi, Machnis side etzbaosav v'dochik bekemach v'kemach nichnachs besoch yado. So Rabbi says, so bepashtos, again, so Papa says, I think the way you do kmitza, Rabbi says you take your fingers, you pretty much put your hand into the flour fills up your fingers, and then you just scoop it up and close your hand. By Papa, kametz baroshe etzbaosav mai. What happens if you did kmitza with the tips of your fingers? Now, what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. Barashe etzbaosav, shehichnis rashe etzbaosav bekemach, upas yado klape kemach, v'kometz below kumso ad pas yado, kitiknuma. So again, shehichnis rashe etzbaosav bekemach, upas yado klape kemach, v'kometz below kumso. So Rabbi says, this is interesting kasha. So what happens if halacha l'maisa, you went ahead and you took it barashe etzbaosav, or minat stadin. So we'll say, what's minat stadin? Take one more look at Rashi. Shenasan gav yado ala kemach, v'holich yado at shenichnas hakemach derach tzido l'soch yado. So we'll say, so this is very interesting. So Rashi has two interpretations of minat stadin. Second interpretation is Rashi says, what happens if you take it from the side of the kli instead of from the middle of the kli? Or in this case over here, ultimately again, Rashi points out over here, so no sin gav yado ala kemach, you put your palm on the flour, baholich yado, and you push your hand down until the flour enters into your hand. Or mimata lemala. Mimata lemala means literally again from the bottom up. What does this mean? Take a look at Rashi once more. Shehichnis etzbaosav bekemach v'gav hayad keneged hakemach v'kometz. So we'll say this is the most dramatic case. What happens if you did the following? Generally, the classic way we're talking about doing kmitza is palm down, right? Palm facing the flour, going ahead. So again, the shaila essentially is palm down, putting your hand all the way in just like this, and then scooping up the flour from the bottom. So in other words, instead of going in fingers down, palm down, fingers down. I go in palm down, and ultimately again, then fingers scooping up from the bottom. That's what the Gemara calls brashe espaosav. Minat stadin, from the side of the kli instead of from the middle of the kli. Case number 3 is, what happens if I go into the flour palm up? So instead what I do is like this. So I have my palm facing up. I push my hand all the way down into the flour and then essentially bring my hand up. And when bringing my hand up, I close my fingers, making the kamitza like that. Does that work? To which the Gemara answers to all of these, teku. Teku. Okay, so the Gemara doesn't answer it. Papa says, Pshitali, below chafnav kidachafni inshi. So Papa says, again, I think below chafnav, Nabo say below chafnav is by Yom Kippur. I think below chafnav is the way that people do chafina. By Papa, chafan barashe esba osav mahu, minat stadin mahu, chafan bezu ubazu, the karvan zu eitzel zu mahu. So Papa asks the same shaylas by chafina. What happens if you did chafina with the tips of your fingers, or if you did it from the side, or what happens if you did chafina with 2 individual hands and then brought them together? Again, I will say this is by the Ketores on Yom Kippur. What's the halacha? Teku. It's interesting. The Gemara doesn't answer it. By Papa. So I will say, so just so you understand that for our purposes, again, that's why we're going that with classic chafina, the way that it's done is palms down. You push your fingers first into the flour. Essentially push fingers all the way in until the palm is pretty much hitting the top of the flour, and then again scoop up whatever you can with your 3 middle fingers, shave off the sides with the thumb and the pinky. Are there other ways to do it? So the Gemara doesn't say there's not. The Gemara just is not sure if you did it those other ways, are you yotze or not? That's the teku. And interestingly enough, this is by other cases of scoopage as well. So apparently again, it's not just by mincha, it's not just by kmitza, but these same discussions apply by chafina, which is the scooping of the ketores on Yom Kippur as well. Okay, incredible. So the Gemara goes right there. Papa. So we'll say another interesting question. So now we'll say, let's go through the progression over here. What do you do with the kamitza after you take it? So remember again, kamitza is placed in a klisharis. So now we'll say, now the Gemara is asking about the mechanics of placement in the klisharis. Let's say you didn't put it in the bottom of the klisharis. Instead, what did you do? You put it on the side of the klisharis. Literally means dafka lekometz, but that means you stuck it on the side. What's the halacha over there? On one hand, we require the placement of the komets inside of the kli, and it's inside. Or no, maybe you need normative placement or primary placement, in which case this does not satisfy the criteria, to which the Gemara says, teku. We're not sure. So we'll say, watch this. Let's say you went ahead and you have a klisharis and you overturned it. And now you place the komets on the bottom of the kli. Now, both say, Rashi points out, as well as the Shita says, that it may be the easiest way to imagine this is if you have a kli that has a base, right? A klisharis that has a base. So generally, when a utensil has a base, that means the base usually has like a hollowed out area inside of it as well. So imagine for a moment you're turning over the kli, you have the hollowed out base, you place the komets, now you're placing it's interesting, you're placing the komets on the bottom of the kli. So is that called placement in a klisharis or not? On one hand, we require placement in a klisharis. Is it in a klisharis? Yeah, it's in a klisharis. No, maybe we need normal placement in a klisharis. It doesn't satisfy the criteria, to which the Gemara says, teku. The Gemara leaves this as an open-ended question. Okay, incredible. So we'll say the Mishnah goes on. Keitzatu ose. So it's interesting. Now the Mishnah says, how do you do kamitza? So Poshet says, you extend your 3 middle fingers on your palm. And what's the halacha? Right? That's how you do kamitza. As we just said before, and I will say again, as we're seeing halacha l'maisa, the way you do it, push everything down onto the flour, extend your fingers into the flour, or go fingers first into the flour, and ultimately scoop up that way. The Gemara says, riba shmana, chaser shmana, if you put in too much oil, or you are lacking enough oil, or chisar levonasa, or you went ahead and you are deficient in your frankincense amount, ultimately, again, the mincha will be pasul. Incredible. So let's analyze. Says the Gemara, Hechi dami riba shmana. So we'll say, so the Mishnah says very simple. Now again, I will say, one of the things we have to get into over here is exactly like when is oil introduced, which menachos have oil, when do you have lavona? We're going to get into all of that. Right now, let's deal with the rules. Right, the rule is if you have too much oil or too little oil, your mincha is invalid. So the Gemara says, Hechi dami riba shmana. How much is too much oil? How much is too much? Amar Rabbi Lazar, kigon shehifresh shnei lugin. So we'll say, so now remember again, one of the important things that we have learned is, remember, on a typical mincha, how much flour do you use? An isaron, right? And now, how much oil do you use for a typical mincha? A lug. So therefore, again, Rabbi Lazar says, how much oil is too much oil? 2 lugin. You double the amount. That's too much oil that ultimately, again, would invalidate your mincha. Kigon shefresh la shnei lugin. Okay, you set aside 2 lugin for this mincha. But look, kigon the ariv ba shemen dechulin b'shemen dechaberta. But why do you have to do it like that? In other words, why not just say, you have your regular 1 lug for the mincha, and then you mixed in some other chulin oil, mundane oil, or oil from another mincha. Well, maybe you'll say, maybe chulin oil or maybe oil from another mincha doesn't invalidate your mincha. That's not true, because maskef la marzutra bartovia alameata minchas choti de pasal b'shemen heichem mishkachasla. Now, remember again, we learned one of the menachos that does not have oil is which kind of mincha? The sinner's mincha. Sinner's mincha is just flour. There's no oil. So ultimately, again, the Gemara says, if that's true, that mincha, that chulin oil or that oil from another mincha doesn't invalidate, then how would you ever have a case of a minchas chote that could become possible through the inclusion of oil? Ididei halesle. If it's its own oil, that's not possible because the minchas chote doesn't have oil. And if it's chulin oil or oil from another mincha, ha'amrit lo pasli. You just said before that doesn't invalidate. The amish, Sigmar says, skip Rabbi Lazar, lomi boy come. Rabbi Lazar says, lomi boy the chulin the chaverta the pasal. So we'll say this. Rabbi Lazar says like this. We'll say lomi boy means you don't even have to say this. It goes without saying. It goes without saying that if you have a mincha and you introduce into that mincha chulin oil or oil from another mincha, that absolutely invalidates the mincha. That's obvious. That goes without saying. Aval hifresh lugin, but I would have thought that if you designated 2 lugin of oil for this mincha, that shouldn't invalidate it. Why? Because we're both say at the end of the day, each lug individually is fit for this mincha. Both are not together, but each one individually. So in other words, it goes without saying that if you introduce foreign oil, what's foreign oil? Again, chulin oil or oil from another mincha, that will certainly invalidate. But the havamina is, I would have thought that maybe again 2 lugin for 1 mincha shouldn't invalidate because both are technically fit. Kamash Malon, no. Kamash Malon says that if you go ahead and you designate 2 lugin, ultimately again for 1 mincha, that will invalidate the mincha. So the Gemara says, how does Rabbi Lazar know this? Because Rabbi Lazar saw difficult in the Mishnah. My area detani riba shmana. Why does the Mishnah say riba shmana, that you increased the volume of its oil? Why not just say lisna riba la shemen? Suppose they hear this. What Rabbi Lazar is picking up on is, it doesn't say you included too much oil. Rather, it says you included too much of its oil. Possessive. Why do that? Hakamash malan da'afagav dehifresh la shnei lugin. Because again, the chiddush is, even though you designated this extra lug for this mincha, and I might have thought that doesn't, right, foreign oil will definitely go ahead and invalidate. But going ahead and identifying or setting aside an extra lug for this mincha, since each lug individually is fit, I would have thought that doesn't invalidate. Kamash malon, it does. Incredible. So therefore, it seems like the Gemara is concluding this, that halacha l'maisa, the definition of extra oil, which would disqualify a carbon mincha, is a whole extra lug. Goes without saying, foreign oil will go ahead and disqualify, but even its own additional lug will disqualify as well. So again, now the Mishnah says, if you have too little lavona, right? You don't have the requisite measure of Lavona. Ultimately, again, the mincha is going to be puzzled. Tarabanan. Chasra va'amda karat echad psula. If ultimately, again, the Lavona is deficient, and all you have is literally one korat. Korat means not a grain. A grain. Yeah, one piece. One piece. Now, I'll say, just so you understand, by the way, frankincense. What is frankincense? Frankincense is made from the resin of a tree. And the way, if you ever if you Google frankincense, the way it looks, I will say, is it looks like pieces. You know what it looks like? You ever go to the shuk, and in the shuk, you know those guys who are selling tea? I mean, that's a front. They're not really selling tea. Whatever, this selling tea, and you ever see the way that tea looks, right? It's like pieces, right? It looks like crystallized. It looks like candy, actually. Right? It looks like crystallized pieces. So frankincense is bigger. I'm sorry. Sap, right? So it's a resin from which, and it's a hardened. When it hardens into pieces. So that's why frankincense, as opposed to, let's say, flour, right? Fine flour, which is like a powder. Ultimately, again, so frankincense is made up of these little pieces, these little resin pieces. So that's why so therefore the Gemara says like this: if ultimately, again, the measure of Lavona is deficient, and all you have is one piece, psula. Ashnei karatin, but if you have two pieces, kshera. Rabbi Yehuda says the minimum amount of lavona that you need to make your mincha kosher, ultimately again is going to be two pieces. Rabbi Shimon says al korat echad kshera pachos mikan psula. Rabbi Shimon says no, all you need is one piece. One little piece of lavona is enough. Less than one complete piece, ultimately, again, is going to be possible. But we learned, Silimar says, komets ulavona shechaser kol shehu. Yeah, we learned that by komets and lavona, if it's missing any amount, ultimately it's deficient. Tani korat lavona shechaser kol shehu pasal. So again, I will say, at least according to Rabbi Shimon, read it as if you have less than one piece of lavona, ultimately the mincha is going to be possible. But the other possibility could also be, it depends how you're bringing the lavona. Remember again, I will say, a person can pledge a carbon of lavona. So perhaps the laws of lavona will be different if you're bringing lavona as an accompaniment to your mincha, versus if you're bringing a standalone lavona carbon. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Lavona abayma mincha is the second line down from the top in Rashi. Im chasra b'shas haktara kshera. Ultimately, again, so according to right, im chasra b'shas haktara kshera Rabbi Shimon kidiyaf lekameh. Mikal lavona ashar lamincha v'haidik tani chasra kol shu pasal belavona haba b'fnei atzma. So perhaps when you're going ahead and you're bringing lavona itself as a carbon, if it's deficient in any way, so the carbon is going to be invalid. Kagona omer harei alai lavona yavi malokum so lavona al mizbeach. If you say I'm bringing a lavona offering, you must bring a complete kometz of lavona. If that kometz is deficient, your carbon is invalid. However, the Gemara says, the Hasam Badei Chasar Pasal, the Lok Sidbe Vemes Kalavana Diafina. So that's the distinction. Halacha l'maisa, perhaps if you're bringing a carbon of lavona, you must bring a complete and intact kometz. Failure to do so ultimately invalidates the carbon. However, again, if the lavona is part of a mincha, then perhaps that's even if the lavona is deficient, as long as there is some basic unit of intact lavona. How much of an intact unit of lavona do you need? Okay, so that's a machlokes. So it says, the reality is, there's a three-way machlokes about how much lavona is needed, and by the way, when it's going to be needed. Watch this. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Meir says, kometz betchila, the kometz basov. Okay, so we'll say, so Rabbi Meir is the most chamer. Rabbi Meir says, you need a kometz of lavona at the beginning. I will say, now, let's define our terms over here. Betchila means, if you look at Rashi is right across. Kometz betchila, b'shas mitzah, ba'inan sheyehi bekli malei kometz lavona, u'baha kulu molde de betchila by kometz. So both says, listen to this. Meir says, in the beginning. Now, what does in the beginning mean? In the beginning means when the kmitza itself, at the time that the kmitza is being taken, right? At the time the kmitza is being taken, you need a kmitza of lavona present. Now, again, I will say, we're going to see where the lavona is positioned. Clearly, what we know is the lavona is present, but the lavona is not taken, right? Because remember, this is a previous Mishnah. The kmitza itself of the flour must just be a flour. If you get lavona mixed into the kmitza of your flour, then the kmitza of your flour is invalidated. But again, Rameir says there has to be a kmitza of lavona present when the kmitza of the flour is going to be taken. Okay, the kometz basol. Now Rameir adds in over here, not only that, at the time that the kmitza is being burned, there must be an existing kometz of lavona. So Rameir essentially says that there must be a kometz of lavona from the beginning of this process till the end of this process. Okay, that's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Huda says kometz betchila. And again, I want to point out we're gonna bring this whole mincha process together, right? Because the other thing that we haven't discussed is oil. Right? When is oil put in? How is it put in? How does that? So again, right now, what we're doing is we're assembling information, and then Amir Hashem, we're going to paint a beautiful, beautiful mincha portrait with it in just a little bit. Rabbi Yehuda Savar, kometz betchila u'shnei karatim basof. Rabbi Yehuda says, yes, I agree. You have to begin at the time of the kmitza of the mincha. There has to be an existing kmitza of lavona as well. However, at the time that you burn the kmitza, even if your kmitza of lavona became deficient, you're good as long as what? You have 2 pieces of lavona left. Right? As long as there's at least 2 pieces of lavona, you're good to go. Rabbi Shimon says, kometz betchila v'koret echad besof. Rabbi Shimon says, you must have a kometz of lavona at the beginning of the mincha process, and as long as you have at least 1 piece of lavona at the time that the kometz, the kmitza, is burned, you're good to go. Now I will say, so this is our machlokes. Let's go with what everybody agrees with. What does everybody agree with? That halacha l'maisa, you need to have a kometz of lavona at the beginning of this process. Beginning of this process is defined at the time you take the kmitza. I will say, so just to illustrate this, the pashtos, the way it sounds like over here, is that, right, so you're going ahead, you're putting the flour into a sharis, you'll put the kmitza of lavona, kmitza frankincense, onto that kli sharis as well. So it's present, it's there. You'll take the kmitza of flour. So then again, I will say everyone is agreeing that there must be a kometz of lavona at the time you take the kmitza of the flour. Everyone also agrees that there must be lavona in existence at the time you burn the kmitza of flour. Right? Time you burn the kometz of flour. The shaila is how much lavona do you need at the time that the kometz of flour is burned? That's our 3 machlokes. Shemer says you need all of it. Rabbi Yehuda says you need at least 2 pieces of it, and Rabbi Shimon says you only need 1 piece of it. That's our 3-way machlokes. Ushloshta mikra echad darshan, and all 3 of them darshan the same pasuk. What's the pasuk? Es kol halavona asher ala mincha. All of the lavona that's on the mincha. Rameir holds ad the isei lavona the ikba bahadi mincha meikara. So Rameir holds that ultimately again you need all of the lavona the entire time through. The entire amount of lavona that was there at the time that the mincha identity was concretized, i.e. at kmitza, that's the lavona that has to remain with you the entire time. Rabbi Yehuda holds, kol va'afilu chad koret. So kol means even 1 grain, one piece. Es l'rabos koret acher. And the word es is usually a ribui. Es comes to include 1 additional piece as well, which gives you 2 pieces. Rabbi Shimon es lo darsh. Rabbi Shimon doesn't darshan es. And therefore, again, he holds all you need is 1 piece of kitoras. Incredible. Sorry, I keep saying kitoras. Lavona, frankincense. Sorry, 1 piece of frankincense. So I will say, so this is our 3-way machlokes. Again, everyone agreeing you need a full kmitza of lavona to start this process. Rabbi Meir, you need it the whole way through up till the burning of the kmitza. Rabbi Huda, you need 2 pieces of lavona. Rabbi Shimon, 1 piece of lavona. All of them darshing in the same pasuk. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef, Rabbi Yochanan. Machlokes b'lavona haba im mincha. This whole machlokes is only when it comes to the lavona which ultimately again is brought together with the mincha. But let's say someone, as we mentioned before, let's say someone is bringing a carbon of lavona on their own. So I'm offering up a carbon of lavona. So what's the halacha? Divrei hakol komes betchila, the komes basof. Everyone agrees, Rabbi say, that if you're just bringing a self-standing carbon of lavona, that again, the shear is a kamitza, right? It's a kamitza when you take it, and it has to be a kamitza when you burn it. Everyone agrees that that full shear must be intact. So the Gemara says, Lahachi itzterich asher ala mincha. That's why the pasuk, when it talks about the lavona that is on the mincha, tebahade mincha in bifnei ma'atz malo. That ultimately, again, the only time there's a machlokes about how do you need the full kamitza of lavona is only by the mincha. It's only by the mincha. So by the mincha there's a machlokes, but when you are bringing lavona by itself, everyone will agree that halacha l'maisa, you need the full kamitza of the lavona at the time that it's taken and at the time that it is burned as well. Incredible. Machlokes b'lavona abayim mincha. So Rabbi, another interesting fact over here. This machlokes about how much kamitza do you need at the time, how much lavona do you need at the time that the kamitza of flour is burned, that's only a machlokes about lavona that's coming with a mincha. Okay, so we'll say, here we go. So essentially what we're going to see is, there are three different places. I mean, there's more than three, but for our purposes, three situations in which you are bringing lavona. What are the three situations? Number one, lavona that accompanies mincha, right? Number two, a carbon lavona that you decide to bring on your own. And now number three is the lechem hapanim. So remember, you're going to say, on the shulchan upon which the lechem hapanim was situated, there were two, we call them spoons, but they're really small ladles. What was on those ladles? What was on those ladles? What was in those ladles? Lavona, frankincense. And the way it would work was on Shabbos, when the loaves were removed from the shulchan, so what would happen? The loaves were given to the kohanim, and again, those two ladles of frankincense, of lavona, were burned on the mizbeach. Because remember, again, I will say, there's no part of lechem hapanim itself that is burnt on the mizbeach. Lechem hapanim is consumed. So ultimately, again, you would take the lavona from these two ladles, and you would burn that on the mizbeach. So Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef says like this: the machlokes by lavona ultimately again is only with lavona that comes with the mincha. It comes with the mincha. However, but ultimately again the lavona that comes with, that's in the ladles on the shulchan, divrei hakol shnei kamatzin betchila ushnei kamatzin b'sof. Shabbos said, this is incredible. Everyone agrees that ultimately, again, remember, there were two kamatzin. Each of those ladles, each of those spoons on the shulchan held a kamitza. Held the kamitza. So therefore, again, there was essentially two ladles, each holding a kamitza. You had to have two kamitzos put on there in the beginning of the week, and on Shabbos, when you burn that lavona, there had to be two existing kamitzos as well, full measure. Or otherwise stated, the only time that there's a machlokes as to whether or not you need the full kamitza of the lavona to be intact is only when the lavona is brought with the mincha. But if lavona is brought on its own, or the lavona of the lechem hapanim, ultimately everyone agrees that the kamitza has to be fully intact. We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up Emir Hashem with the kamitza or with the lavona of the lechem hapanim tomorrow. Exciting sugya. We'll say shkoyach. Okay. Everyone on Zoom, have a great day.